The sky was a pale steel gray, the kind of overcast that makes silence feel heavier. The honor guard stood rigid in formation, their breath barely visible in the crisp October air. Each movement, precise. Each stance, flawless. The general's funeral was nearing its final moments. The American flag folded with sacred care, the 21-gun salute echoing like history itself. Rows of high-ranking officers, politicians, and old comrades lined the cemetery grounds, united by respect, legacy, and expectation. Everything was by the book, until the old man appeared at the gates. He was hunched, slow, and leaning hard into a metal walker that clinked with every step. His jacket, an olive-green relic from another era, hung loosely from his thin frame, and on the lapel sat a weathered purple heart pin, dulled by time. Heads turned subtly, whispers flickered among the civilians, and even the soldiers, trained not to break, began to glance with quiet curiosity. Who was he? Why now? Why like this? He took his time crossing the grass, his legs trembling beneath the weight of years, and something deeper, something unfinished. He didn't stop at the perimeter. He didn't ask permission. He walked straight to the casket like a man walking back into a memory. The guards didn't stop him. No one moved. And when he finally reached the side of the casket, he placed a trembling hand on the polished wood, leaned in close, and whispered 6 words that no one else could hear. Whatever he said, it made 2 of the soldiers nearest the coffin break their discipline for just a moment. Their eyes widened. One clenched his jaw. The other lowered his head, not in shame, but reverence. What the mourners didn't yet know was that this man had once been thought dead, presumed lost in a war zone no one talks about anymore. But he had returned, not to claim glory, not to tell his story, but to fulfill the last request of the man now buried with stars on his shoulders. And in that moment, every medal, every speech, every title faded, because loyalty had just walked in, late, worn out, and right on time. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. If you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey together. Arlington National Cemetery held a stillness that morning that went beyond reverence. It was November 15th, and the Virginia air carried the bite of approaching winter through rows of white headstones that stretched like silent sentinels across the rolling hills. The funeral of General Marcus Kellerman had drawn 300 mourners, including active duty officers, Pentagon officials, and family members who had traveled from across the country. The honor guard, 8 soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Regiment, had been positioned since dawn, their rifles gleaming, their faces set in the ceremonial mask that speaks of both grief and honor. The service had begun punctually at 11. Military funerals always do. Precision is a form of respect, and General Kellerman had earned every measure of precision the Army could provide. He had served for 38 years, commanded troops in 3 conflicts, and retired with enough medals to fill a display case. The eulogy had been delivered by a congressman who spoke of leadership and sacrifice. The chaplain had offered prayers for a life well lived. The bugler had played taps with the haunting perfection that turns silence into something sacred. But throughout the ceremony, something felt incomplete. Not in the protocol, that had been flawless. Not in the attendance. The turnout had been substantial. Something else. Something unspoken that hung in the air like morning mist, making even the most seasoned officers shift slightly on their feet. General Kellerman's daughter, Sarah, stood closest to the casket. She had organized everything according to her father's wishes, down to the choice of hymns and the arrangement of flowers. But she found herself glancing toward the cemetery entrance, as if expecting someone who hadn't yet arrived. Her father had been a man of few words about his military service, especially about Vietnam, but in his final days he had mentioned a name: Frank Morrison, a soldier who had served under him during the war. "He'll come," her father had whispered from his hospital bed. "He always keeps his promises." Sarah had tried to locate this Frank Morrison, but military records from that era were scattered, and 50 years is a long time for memories to fade or men to disappear. She had assumed he might be dead, or perhaps too old to travel. But something in her father's voice had carried absolute certainty. Not hope, certainty. As if some promises transcend time, distance, and even death itself. The ceremony was reaching its conclusion when the figure appeared at the cemetery gates. At first, nobody paid attention. People arrive late to public events all the time. But this was different. This was a man who moved with purpose despite his obvious physical limitations. His walker caught slightly on the uneven ground, but he never stopped, never hesitated. He wore a dark suit that had been carefully pressed despite its age, and on his lapel, barely visible from a distance, was a small purple ribbon attached to a heart-shaped medal. The honor guard noticed him first. Soldiers are trained to assess threats and anomalies, and something about this man's approach triggered their attention without raising alarm. He wasn't hurrying, but there was urgency in his movement. He wasn't looking around at the crowd, but his eyes were fixed on the casket with laser focus. And when the wind shifted his jacket lapel, revealing that purple heart pin more clearly, Sergeant First Class David Chun, the honor guard leader, felt something click into place in his mind. Frank Morrison was 84 years old, and every step across that cemetery was a negotiation with arthritis, hip replacements, and the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent in service to others. His walker wasn't just a mobility aid. It was a partner in a journey that had brought him to dozens of military funerals over the decades. But this one was different. This one was personal in a way that went beyond friendship or shared service. This one was about keeping a promise that had been made in a jungle clearing in 1971, when dying soldiers had asked him to remember them, and he had sworn on his life that he would. The crowd began to notice him now. Whispers started in the back rows and moved forward like ripples on water. Some people recognized the significance of the Purple Heart. Others simply saw an elderly veteran paying his respects. But the honor guard saw something else entirely. They saw the way he moved, not with the shuffle of old age, but with the measured steps of a man who understood the weight of sacred ground. They saw how he held himself despite the walker, spine straight, shoulders back, carrying himself like a soldier even in civilian clothes. Sarah Kellerman watched him approach, and something in her chest began to pound with recognition she couldn't explain. This had to be him. This had to be Frank Morrison. The man her father had been certain would come. The man who apparently had never failed to keep a promise in 50 years of promises made and kept. The honor guard maintained their formation as Frank reached the perimeter of the ceremony. Protocol demanded they remain at attention regardless of external distractions. But protocol hadn't prepared them for this moment, for the sight of a veteran older than their grandfathers moving toward their position with the determination of a man on a mission that transcended ceremony. Frank paused at the edge of the gathered mourners, not from exhaustion but from respect. He wasn't here to disrupt the proceedings. He was here to fulfill an obligation that had been weighing on his soul for half a century. His eyes swept the crowd once, taking in the uniforms and medals and solemn faces, then returned to the casket. General Marcus Kellerman, the man who had led them through hell and brought them home. The man who had earned the loyalty of soldiers who would follow him anywhere, including into the worst fighting of a war that most Americans wanted to forget. What the crowd didn't know, what even Sarah didn't fully understand, was that Frank Morrison had been making this journey for decades. Not to this cemetery, but to dozens of others. He had been visiting graves, attending funerals, and keeping track of the men who had served under General Kellerman during those terrible months in Vietnam. He had been their unofficial guardian, their keeper of memory, their link to a brotherhood that existed beyond death. The ceremony concluded with the folding of the flag. Each fold was executed with ceremonial precision, transforming the stars and stripes into a tight triangle that would be presented to the family. The honor guard's movements were synchronized, their faces impassive, their handling of the flag reverent. This was the moment when military funerals shift from public ceremony to private grief, when the crowd begins to disperse and the immediate family is left alone with their loss. But Frank Morrison didn't move with the crowd. Instead, he began his slow approach toward the casket, his walker tapping softly against the ground in a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of everyone who noticed him. The honor guard remained at their posts, but their attention was no longer distributed across the crowd. Every eye was on this old man who had waited until the formal ceremony ended before beginning his personal goodbye. Sarah stepped forward, instinctively understanding that this moment belonged to him. The Pentagon officials and congressmen could wait. The family could wait. This was between Frank Morrison and General Marcus Kellerman. and whatever had passed between them 50 years ago in a war zone that had shaped both their lives forever. Frank reached the casket and stopped. He didn't lean heavily on his walker or show signs of fatigue. Instead, he straightened as much as his aged body would allow. And for a moment, just a moment, the years seemed to fall away. The honor guard could see it. Sarah could see it. Anyone who was paying attention could see the young soldier he had once been, standing at attention in the presence of his commanding officer one final time. The cemetery had fallen completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself recognized the solemnity of this moment. Frank's lips moved, but his voice was so quiet that only the nearest members of the honor guard could hear the words. And what they heard made every one of them fight back tears while maintaining their military bearing. "I'm sorry I'm late, sir," Frank whispered to the casket. "Had to stop and visit Tommy, Rodriguez, and Baker first. They're buried just down the hill. I told them you were finally coming home." The impact of those words hit the honor guard like a physical blow. Sergeant First Class Chin felt his throat constrict as the full meaning became clear. This man, this elderly veteran with the Purple Heart and the walker, had been visiting the graves of soldiers who had died under General Kellerman's command 50 years ago. He hadn't just come to pay his respects to the general. He had been making the rounds, visiting the dead, keeping promises that most people would have forgotten decades ago. Private Rodriguez, standing third in the formation, felt tears threatening behind his sunglasses as he realized this man shared a name with one of the soldiers Frank had just mentioned. His grandfather, perhaps, or his uncle. A connection across generations, maintained by a man who had never stopped caring, never stopped remembering, never stopped honoring the dead. Frank wasn't finished. He leaned slightly closer to the casket, his voice still barely audible, but carrying the weight of 5 decades of grief and love and unbreakable loyalty. "They wanted me to tell you they're proud of how you led us. Every one of them. Even Tommy, who used to complain about the early morning inspections. He said to tell you he understands now why you made us do things the hard way. Said it kept more of us alive than should have made it home." The honor guard exchanged glances without moving their heads, a skill learned through years of military discipline. Each of them was processing the same realization. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just an old man saying goodbye to his former commander, but the continuation of a bond that had survived war, time, separation, and death itself. Sarah Kellerman stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. Her father had never spoken much about the war, but she had always sensed that his experiences in Vietnam had shaped him in ways she didn't fully understand. Now, listening to this stranger speak to her father's casket with such intimate knowledge, she began to comprehend the depth of connections forged in combat. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were family, brothers bound by shared experience that civilians could never fully grasp. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he reached out and touched the flag that covered the casket. His fingers lingered for a moment on the stars and stripes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Not weakness, but the sound of a man releasing something he had carried for too long. "Rodriguez asked me to tell you about his grandson. Same name, serves in the army now. 3rd-generation soldier. Tommy's boy became a teacher, just like he always said he would if he made it home. And Baker." Frank paused, his voice catching slightly. "Baker's daughter named her son after you, General. Marcus. He's 25 now, married, has kids of his own. They don't even know why, but the name got passed down. Some things survive even when the stories get lost." The honor guard was beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a goodbye. They were seeing the delivery of a report. Frank Morrison had been keeping track of these families, these bloodlines, these continuing stories for half a century. He had been the guardian not just of graves, but of memory itself, the keeper of connections that might otherwise have been lost to time. Sergeant First Class Chin found himself thinking about his own grandfather, who had served in Korea and had never spoken about it. How many Frank Morrisons were there in the world? How many elderly veterans carrying the weight of remembrance, making sure that the dead weren't forgotten, that the families stayed connected to legacies they might not even fully understand? Frank straightened again, preparing to conclude his visit. But before he could step away, he had one more thing to say. One final message that had been entrusted to him by men who would never grow old, never see their children graduate or their grandchildren born, never have the chance to say these words themselves. They asked me to tell you something else, General, Frank whispered, his voice barely audible, but somehow carrying to every member of the honor guard. They said to tell you that you brought them home. All of us. Even the ones who didn't make it back alive. You brought us home because you never forgot us. You carried us with you. And that's why we could rest easy, knowing somebody remembered, somebody cared, somebody would make sure we didn't just disappear. The silence that followed was profound. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than words. The honor guard stood at attention, but their military discipline couldn't entirely mask the emotional impact of what they had just witnessed. These were young soldiers, most of them with deployment experience, most of them familiar with loss and sacrifice. But seeing this elderly veteran fulfill a promise made 50 years ago, seeing him serve as the bridge between the living and the dead, connected them to something timeless about military service. Frank Morrison began to turn away from the casket, his mission complete. But Sarah Kellerman stepped forward, her voice soft but urgent. "Mr. Morrison," she said, and he paused, looking at her with eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. "My father mentioned you. In the hospital, before he died. He said you would come. He said you always keep your promises." Frank nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Your father was a good man, miss. The best officer I ever served under. He saved more lives than he ever talked about." "He never talked about the war much," Sarah replied. "But I think I understand now why he respected you so much. You've been taking care of his soldiers all these years, haven't you?" "They were my brothers," Frank said simply. "When you lose brothers, you don't stop being their brother. You just find new ways to serve." The honor guard listened to this exchange with growing awareness of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about one old soldier paying respects to one dead general. This was about the continuation of service beyond official duty, about loyalty that transcends death, about the way some men carry the weight of remembrance not as a burden, but as a privilege. Private Martinez, the youngest member of the honor guard, found himself thinking about his own unit, the soldiers he served with in Afghanistan, the bonds forged under fire. Would any of them remember him 50 years from now if he didn't make it home? Would any of them visit his grave, keep track of his family, make sure his story didn't disappear into the vast silence of military history? Looking at Frank Morrison, he realized that some would. Some soldiers carry that responsibility naturally, without being asked, without recognition, without thanks. They become the keepers of memory, the guardians of brotherhood, the living links between past and present. Frank began his slow journey back across the cemetery, his walker tapping against the ground in that same measured rhythm. But he wasn't alone now. Sarah Kellerman walked beside him, asking quiet questions about her father's service, about the men who had died under his command, about the connections that had been maintained across 5 decades of civilian life. The honor guard remained at their posts until the last of the mourners had departed. As they finally broke formation and began the careful process of securing their equipment, Sergeant First Class Chin found himself looking down the hill toward the older sections of the cemetery, where the headstones were smaller and the grass was older. Somewhere down there were the graves Frank Morrison had visited before coming to the general's funeral. Tommy, Rodriguez, and Baker, soldiers who had died young, whose stories had been preserved by one man's refusal to let them be forgotten. That night, each member of the honor guard would go home and call someone they served with. Not because they were ordered to, but because they had seen something that day that reminded them why brotherhood matters, why memory matters, why some promises are too important to be broken by time or distance or death. Frank Morrison never sought recognition for his decades of remembrance. He didn't write books about his experiences or give speeches about military service. He simply kept his promises, visited graves, maintained connections, and served as a bridge between the living and the dead. He understood something that the younger soldiers were just beginning to learn, that service doesn't end with discharge, that brotherhood doesn't end with deployment, and that the truest honor is often found not in medals or ceremonies, but in the quiet, persistent act of remembering. The general's funeral had been a formal ceremony, complete with official honors and public recognition. But the real memorial had been delivered in whispered words by an elderly man with a walker, carrying messages from the dead to their commanding officer, maintaining connections that most people would have forgotten, serving as proof that some bonds are too strong to be broken by anything the world can throw at them. As Frank Morrison slowly made his way to his car, supported by his walker and accompanied by the general's daughter, the honor guard finished their duties with a deeper understanding of what they were protecting. Not just the ceremony, not just the flag, not just the military tradition. They were protecting the promise that no soldier dies forgotten, that every life matters, that brotherhood extends beyond death itself. Sometimes a hero doesn't wear a uniform anymore. Sometimes he moves slowly with a walker, speaks in whispers, and arrives late to funerals because he has other graves to visit first. Sometimes heroism looks like an elderly man who has spent 50 years keeping promises to the dead, maintaining connections between families and fallen soldiers, serving as the living embodiment of the military creed that no one is left behind. Frank Morrison never asked for thanks. He never sought recognition. He simply understood that some responsibilities transcend official duty, that some promises must be kept regardless of personal cost, and that the truest measure of a soldier's worth is not found in his service record, but in his willingness to serve long after the uniform has been put away. The honor guard would remember this day for the rest of their careers, not because of the ceremony they performed, but because of the ceremony they witnessed. The sight of an old man delivering messages from the dead, maintaining bonds across decades, serving as proof that love and loyalty and remembrance can survive anything the world can throw at them. In the end, Frank Morrison's whispered words at General Kellerman's casket weren't just a personal goodbye. They were a reminder that military service is about more than individual heroism or unit accomplishment. It's about connection, about remembrance, about the understanding that when you serve alongside someone, you become part of their story forever, and they become part of yours. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to have someone like Frank Morrison in your unit, that connection will outlast deployment, outlast discharge, outlast life itself. Because some soldiers understand that the deepest honor doesn't come from medals or recognition. It comes from keeping faith with the dead, maintaining bonds with the living, and serving as proof that no sacrifice is ever forgotten by those who truly understand what it means to be a brother in arms. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who kept promises long after others had forgotten them? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they continue to inspire your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.